Alright, today we're going to be looking at the conflict in North America that is going to be brewing. This is generally the turn of the century of 1700 to roughly 1763. Now, a few features that need to be looked at before we get into the conflict of North America is what's going on around North America before that point. The Spanish initially in the 1500s onward had established quite a bit of a big empire in South America, and they did have some territory in North America as well. However, as time went on, they really didn't have a stronghold in South America or parts of North America, and this is due to a very low population or footprint in these areas. That's in part due to the lack of actually finding gold and silver, which was the main motivation for the Spanish coming over to this region in the first place. They didn't find it, and therefore less and less people as time went on came over to the region to look for it. They were also distracted by efforts to control the Native Americans. They were trying to convert them to Catholicism, essentially make them like the Spanish culture and civilization. And so a lot of time and efforts were made to ensure that that happened, and essentially make sure they didn't rise up and cause conflict. And that did happen from time to time. So this prevented a lot of Spanish from the mainland to come over and settle. You're generally not going to come over to a new land and start a new life when there's a lot of conflict going on. And so many of the Spanish decided that staying in Spain and running the risks in Spain was far greater than going abroad to do so. And then finally, they failed to develop a self sustaining economy. They're very reliant on trade and other forces for their economy. And so, while, for example, in North America with the English colonies, they produced enough agriculture, they developed an economy that may be tobacco, that could be the wood lumbering industry that could sustain them. That did not happen in Spain or the Spanish territories in North and South America. So the main focus of the Spanish were to convert the North Americans to Catholicism, build forts to maintain control, and finally to search for gold and silver and those precious metals. So since they were focused on these efforts and not actually having a sustained colony or region or presence inhabited by Spanish, or incorporating the Indians in a more fair way. As a result, there was little Spaniards in these regions, and they really weren't a force to be reckoned with. And as time went on, they reduced their role in North and South America. Now, on the other side of the sphere, you have France. Now, France is going to be competing with the British. There's a long standing competition between these two countries, and that's going to carry on in North America as well. Now, even from early times, certainly in the medieval period, the French and the British were competing in Europe. They're competing for resources, competing for land, prestige. Warfare ensued, and there was competition between these groups because of that. Now they're going to take those rivalries and they're going to bring them with them to North America. They're going to be competing for resources, land, territory, and prestige in the world scene. So, to begin with, we go to the 1600s with France. Then we'll get to where that competition develops. So, in 1603, Samuel de Champlain is going to claim much of North America for France. He's going to be a very busy guy. In 1603, he establishes Port Royal in a region to the north of the St. Lawrence River. This is going to be called Arcadia. In 1608, he establishes the beginning colony of Quebec, which is going to balloon and become one of the major capitals in Canada, and is going to be the main force in which the French exude their influence on North America. In 1609, just a year later, he is going to be traveling with a group of friendly Huron Native Americans from that tribe of Huron. And uh, these Indians do have conflicts with other tribes in this region. That conflict is going to be with the Iroquois Indians. And what he's going to do, and many of the other French who are traveling with these tribes, uh, they're going to be traveling with these tribes, and then the Iroquois attack the Huron tribe. And as a result, the French are going to open fire with their guns, which are incredibly surprising to the Native Americans, and they flee immediately. But because of this event, the Iroquois are not going to be very pleased with the French. They're going to have a long-standing hatred against the French, and so the Iroquois become quick allies to the British later down the road. And so, for much of the French time in North America, they're going to consider the Iroquois Indians and many of the other Indians more of a threat to them than the British colonies. Now, this region in what is modern day Canada is going to be called New France. And initially, the growth of these colonies is going to be relatively slow. They're only going to open them up to French Catholics. And so, very little amount of people are going to travel from France over to New France. You're looking at maybe roughly around 30 to 40,000 individuals in New France. In 1665, however, they opened it up to all settlers from France. And so at that point, you're going to get a huge immigration of French over to Canada. And so then Canada starts to really get moving as far as population is concerned. Now, some of the advantages of the French colonization of this region is they developed cooperative relationships with the Native Americans, outside of the Iroquois, of course. So they were practicing diplomacy. They talked with the Native Americans, figured out where these tribes were, what their wants and needs were, and partly the reason why they did that was they wanted to trade with the Native Americans and make a profit and bring that profit back to Europe, or France in this case. What they also did was they settled on rivers which were not claimed by Native Americans, so they didn't compete with the Native Americans for land. The Native Americans wanted the land to grow their crops, so they didn't have a huge presence in these regions to compete with the Native Americans and generally anger them in one way or another. So the French and the Indians actually worked together very well. The French had a thriving fur trade going on, so they basically paid the Native Americans in other goods for these furs, and then the furs would be sent back to France, and then they would sell them on the open market, and they got quite a bit of profit off of this. So the French don't have a huge presence in North America, but it is profiting quite well for the French. One of the advantages certainly is the colonies in North America are going to be relatively low maintenance. They're not going to have the huge costs that the English are going to accrue. For example, the trade and the cost of administration. Many of the problems that the English are going to experience, the French don't really have much of a issue with. Now, further colonization, France is going to claim the Mississippi River and the Louisiana area as French territory. It's going to take a little bit of time to actually establish colonies in these regions. In 1699, for example, Louisiana starts to begin being settled. But we don't get until 1710 the establishment of a capital in this southern region called Mobile, Alabama. And so that is going to be the central capital of the French territory in the South. They also established New Orleans, and they're going to establish a colony there. Initially, this was basically a royal colony, but then it started to become a regular colony that many people are going to inhabit and establish. Now, by 1750, the English are going to have about 1.5 million people in North America, and the French, on the other hand, are going to have 80,000 people. So a vast difference in numbers, and this is going to be key when we get to the conflicts going on between the English and the French. And so the French, because of these numbers, are going to work very closely with the Native Americans. They're going to have many of these Native Americans are going to be allied with the French because they are not encroaching on their territory, or they're not having any sort of armed conflict, they're not taking their land, they're not really conflicting with the Indians because it's bad policy to have any sort of conflict or burden on the Indians, because then you're not going to get the furs or the trade, and then you won't be profitable for the French government. And this is working into the mercantilism economy type of system that was reviewed in another video. And finally, the French aren't going to be burned by the American colonies. If they lose the colonies, for example, they're not going to be hurt too much. Yes, there is some profit being gained, but they don't have the cost of administration or deploying troops or any of those methods. All right, finally reaching the conflicts going on in North America. So in Europe, we have the War of Spanish Succession. This is a war that lasts from 1701 to 1714. What the War of Spanish Succession was essentially you have the French and the Spanish at war with England. Prussia is coming about at this time, and the Netherlands. So this is a war going on in Europe. However, it translates into little, very minor wars going on in North America. In North America, they're going to be called the King William's War and the Queen Anne's War. The King William's War is going to last from 1689 to 1697, which happens a little bit prior to this war, but it was a conflict between the English and Indians and the French. Queen Anne's War is going to last from 1702 to 1713, so this is generally the majority of the war that gets translated from the conflict in Europe. So the rivalries that occur in Europe are going to be transferred over to North America. So there's going to be some conflict, some individuals are going to try take territory and rights away from the French and vice versa, trying to take advantage of the situation since most of the troops are involved in Europe and in the open sea. So many of these soldiers are going to be colonial volunteers, and of course Native American allies. And certainly for the French, that's going to be a majority of the troops used in these wars. Now the peace treaty is going to be signed in 1713. The French are going to lose out on this, and in that agreement, the British are going to be awarded the region called Acadia. And they're going to rename that area Nova Scotia, which will later be fought over against at a later time. Now in Europe, another war ensues. Remember, this war ended officially by 1714. This next war is going to be 1740 to 1798. Now, you're going to have a little minor war that starts in North America. It's going to be the War of Jenkins' Ear, and that spills over into the War of Austrian Succession. That war starts in 1739 and ends in 1748. The War of Austrian Succession occurs from 1740 to 1748. I may have said that wrong. King George's War is going to be from 1744 to 1748 in North America as well. And there are going to be a lot of minor engagements, but the peace treaty doesn't result in much of any sort of result in North America. Essentially, the situation in North America remains unchanged. Now, I'm not getting into details on exactly what territory was taken, lost, given back, and so on. What I really want to demonstrate with these wars and these years is there's a lot of conflict going on between the English and the French, and it spills over to North America. But also what I want to highlight is the amount of conflict going on in a very short period of time. Essentially, in 75 years, you're going to have a war almost every decade. So from 1700, you have a war lasting roughly 13 years. That's going to be very costly for the British and the French. And it's also going to cause some tension between the British and the French, as well as the Native Americans fighting for both these sides. And then in 1740, you're going to have another series of wars, which is going to last roughly 8 years, and also causing more tension and more cost for all sides involved. Now, the big one that everyone generally talks about is, at least known to Americans, is the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War, even though it doesn't last for 7 years. This war starts in 1754 and it ends in 1763, and this is the official dates. There was once again conflict over in North America that would cause some problems. So the big spillover in North America, and another reference is this war actually starts and escalates in North America. Those other wars generally resulted in conflicts in Europe spilling over to North America. Now it's the reverse. So in the Ohio Valley, so we're talking roughly the American states of Illinois, Indiana, and that sort of region. Basically, it's going to be claimed by the French, the English, as well as the Native Americans. So this is basically going to be a boiling point for eventually these three forces to get involved in some sort of conflict. Now, essentially, what happens on the English side is a company is going to be developed, the Ohio Company. And it's actually owned by George Washington's half-brothers, his two half-brothers. Now, George Washington is going to be a very important character in this episode, but also he later becomes the President of the United States, the first one. The French, on the other hand, start establishing some forts in the Ohio Valley. So, upon hearing about this, the Virginian governor sends George Washington to deliver a message to the fort commander of the French forts. Now he travels about 450 miles. He delivers the note, and the French commander, basically the message was to destroy the forts and leave the area because it's claimed by the English. The French refuse. And so now Washington has to travel all the way back 450 miles to deliver this note that he refuses to the Virginia governor. Now, the next year, in 1754, Washington is going to leave with 150 volunteers, as well as their Indian allies, to build a fort of their own in the Ohio Valley to protect, essentially, the area for the English. They're going to establish this fort in what is modern-day Pittsburgh. However, once they arrive at this location, the French had already built a fort at that strategic location. While they are surveying the land, they come across a French patrol. They attack this patrol, and they actually kill the commander. And so what Washington does with his 150 men, as well as the Indian allies, is they establish a fort, which they called Fort Necessity. The French are going to attack this location with their forces, and they defeat George Washington and his forces pretty handily. They were surrounded, they had lost quite a few men, and so George Washington is going to surrender. So with this, they basically give up the Ohio Valley to the French forces, and this is going to be the point where the English and the French are going to be moving towards actual open war upon hearing this news. So what the British decided to do was establish the Albany Congress. And the idea behind the Albany Congress, for the English at least, was to bind the colonies together to make them one united force to combat the French incursions. This was supposed to help the British Empire a little bit to establish some sort of buffer or cooperation against the French. Now, the Albany Congress is going to meet from June 19th to July 10th, 1754. And led by Benjamin Franklin, they are going to organize something they call the Plan of Union. And the Plan of Union was essentially the plan for the colonists to establish a central colonial assembly or government. And what this government's job was to do was organize the defense of the colonies, negotiate Indian relations, whether that be trade or peace negotiations or declarations of war with the Indians. They would also establish trade over the land, basically trade out to the west. And then finally, they would organize taxes to pay for all these programs that they may need for defense, Indian relations, and trade. Now, the English, upon hearing this, didn't agree with this. They thought that this would actually give the colonies way too much freedom and way too much power. On the other side, the colonies thought that this plan would give too much power to the crown. So both sides basically agree to disagree, and basically this ends this Albany Congress without any sort of results whatsoever. But what you can take away from the Albany Congress is it establishes the framework for the Constitution that will be developed after the Revolutionary War and the United States comes into being. So that's important. And you do have some major players from the American Revolution getting their start here. George Washington, for example, in this war, and it can be argued that George Washington started this war. He didn't have to ambush the French patrol. He didn't have to essentially start this war. But also you have Benjamin Franklin also being involved in the political scene, negotiations, and so on. All right. So in 1756 will be the formal declaration of war between the French and English countries. The British are going to deploy troops in North America. This is going to be endorsed by the colonies, so that's key. What they do first is they capture the forts along the Acadia and St. Lawrence River, and they send General Braddock, as well as Washington, George Washington, to invade the Ohio Valley and take back this territory and rid the area of the French. However, they are going to be defeated by French and Indian allies. Basically, the British forces were very confident. They're wearing red in a forest environment. They had zero knowledge of how to fight a war in the forest, because typically their wars were fought where you line up, you shoot at the enemy, you go back and forth, and hope for the best. They were very overconfident. They got completely ambushed and decimated, and George Washington escapes alive with a good amount of the troops, but it was a astounding defeat. General Braddock is going to be killed, and his defeat makes the British really take this war seriously, and certainly forms more support for the declaration of war against France. Upon this war breaking out, this becomes a world war. Essentially, the French and the British have territories in North America, obviously, but also you're going to have England and France going to war, but you're also going to have territory in India and all the seas, the open seas. There's going to be conflict. So this does develop into a world war. Upon this, 45,000 British troops are going to be deployed to North America. Half of this force are going to be recruited from the colonies, and they will fight in these wars. The British are going to win at Quebec, which is the main staging ground for the French in this region. And from that point, essentially, the British troops mop up basically the Native American and the last remaining points of French resistance. And so finally, in February of 1763, a peace treaty is signed. And as a result, England is going to be granted all the French and Spanish territory in North America. So now, from this point, France does not have any colonies in North America. Spain is going to be given the French Louisiana territory to help pay for the war. Now, you might ask, why would the British give up this land? Well, at one point, it gives the Spanish basically a territory to pay for the war. But it also removes the French completely from North America. And as was discussed earlier, the Spanish really don't have anybody in North America. They're still searching for gold, they really don't have the numbers, and so they're really not a threat to the British. So it's basically a carrot given over to the Spanish. Here's some land, don't cause any conflict for us in the mainland. You can have this territory, and we'll keep the peace. Because at this point, that's really what the British wanted. The British had been fighting wars from 1700 to 1713, and then 1740 to 48, and now you have this war from 1756 to 1763. So there's a lot of conflict, a lot of wars, a lot of cost going through, having to pay for all these wars, it was very, very costly. So the British merely just wanted to delay any further wars and have a moment of rest and peace, for example. And that's further going to be encouraged by what I'm about to tell you now. Basically, the cost of the war. Basically, France wants revenge. They were defeated, and it was a very humiliating defeat at the hands of the British. So they want revenge. The cost of that, of course, is going to be later down the road. They're going to be very encouraged when the American Revolution happens, as to see this as an opportunity to get back at the British for removing them from North America. They'll basically help the enemy of their enemies, the Americans. So keep that in mind. This humiliating defeat is really going to shape why, at least one reason, why the French want to help out the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Now, as far as the cost of the war for the British, their debt had doubled just in the course of this war from 1754 to 1763. Military costs are going to skyrocket because now they have to deploy troops to manage this greater empire. They're also going to gain some territories in India. So now they have to deploy troops to India. Remember, this is a world war. But they also do deploy troops in North America for peacekeeping operations, basically. Because while the Declaration of Peace is going to be signed in France, the Native Americans don't really know this is going on. And it's going to take some time to communicate to them that they lost the war, they're going to lose their lands, and they do take some of the lands from the Native Americans. And so as a result, you're going to have to deploy troops to ensure peace is kept in North America, and that's going to cause a lot of problems for the British. So now they have to figure out how to pay for all of this. They certainly want to reduce their debt. So they looked at these spreadsheets, their reports, and basically, although they averaged out that English citizens in England paid about 26 shillings a year in taxes. On the other hand, the colonial citizen in North America paid about 1 shilling per year in taxes. And they looked at this scenario and they said, well, the colonies benefited the most from this war. The English citizens didn't. And so let's even out that tax rate. So they're going to try make the colonial citizens pay more shillings per year for this security. So they have extra security, for example, of the British Army. They also have greater land to use for resources. And so they saw that the colonial citizens benefited the most, and they thought they should pay a little bit for the war and to alleviate the debt and to ensure that protection was maintained. So after this war, King George III now is going to create the Proclamation of 1763. What it did was it drew an imaginary line across North America, and basically what it said was you cannot go beyond this point. Now this point was any land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So there was a greater amount of land that was actually taken from the French, as well as the Spanish, after this war, but they didn't want it settled quite yet. Now they sent 10,000 troops to secure this border, which was far too little to prevent certainly the settling of these regions and to enforce this border. Americans were able to, or colonists, sorry, because they did perceive themselves as British citizens. They did violate this proclamation. They did settle lands in this region beyond the Appalachian Mountains. There were just too few troops to actually maintain this border, secure it, and enforce it, that the colonists would not farm the land or settle the land. Now, the main point of the Proclamation of 1763 was to prevent conflict with the Native Americans. As I mentioned earlier, they had been fighting war for a majority of the 1700s at this point, and we still have the Revolutionary War to talk about. So they wanted to prevent any further conflict with the Native Americans. And to do that, they decided that colonists should stay on their side and basically let the Native Americans do their own thing and maybe at a later point they would expand that line further when they were far more prepared. Maybe some of the debt had been paid off, and so on and so forth. However, the colonists are not going to view this in the same light. They viewed that they were trying to regulate them, and as a result, they had a growing discontent for the British Empire and certainly King George III. They had come from this idea of freedom and managing themselves, and now the British Crown is basically putting forth these laws and legislation to prevent them from doing what they saw was in their right. And they felt a little bit betrayed, a little bit, because they did play a pretty major role in these battles and in these conflicts to win that land, and they wanted some sort of reward or compensation for it, and it wasn't being granted to them. Big picture, the British plan was a good plan: prevent some war, prevent some conflict, get the finances and the economy in order. But at the same time, they really didn't see eye to eye with the colonists, and certainly the colonists wanted some sort of benefit or reward. They did get some land out of this. They just didn't get enough to dissuade them from potentially open rebellion. But essentially, the British are going to do other things to escalate the situation. But that, of course, will be at a later time. Thank you.